Good afternoon to our guests in the room. I trust you're all well. I've just seen a message, a question, will this lecture be recorded? Yes, it will be recorded, Tremaine. I think as soon as I get out of the way, then we'll start the recording. So my name is Rutendo from the Wits Business School Marketing Department. I think some of you know me or we know each other, but it's been a long time since we've seen each other in person. And my role is really very simple for this afternoon is to welcome you, and then I'll hand over to Brian Armstrong, who'll be facilitating this session. And I'm sure from all the Zoom meetings you've had about the few house rules, mute yourselves, please, but you'll find that you're already on mute. And if you'd like to ask any questions, please type them in the chat box. We have a team from Synthesis who are AI experts who will be able to address some of the questions you raise, but some of the questions will be attended to by Brian and our panelists. So as I said, Professor Brian Armstrong, our Director of the BCX Chair in Digital Business, will be facilitating today's event, and he will introduce our speakers. So welcome to you all, and thank you for your time. But before I begin, let me just make a special announcement, and then I'm sure Brian maybe will mention it again. Synthesis, together with our speakers today, have created a list of what they call a digital crash course. This is a collection of their most recommended digital and AI books. All you need to do to win this collection is sign up for the Synthesis newsletter. The competition will close on the 14th of February, and the winner will be announced via social media on the 17th of February. So to sign up, you need to go to their website, which we will post in the chat room. So let me get out of the way and hand over to Brian Armstrong. Brian, over to you.
Thanks, Rutendo, and good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this webinar on artificial intelligence. And the topic is artificial intelligence relevant to all industries? We have a really great panel today to take us through this issue. People who are in industry, doing AI, real AI, practical AI in the workplace, who have personal experience about what's possible, what's not possible now, what might be possible in the future, what the right way to do it is, what the wrong way to do it is. And we're going to get into all these topics. So thank you very much for joining us. We have nominally an hour, but if, when we did the prep call on this, we suddenly realized that we just spent an hour talking about it without even answering any of your questions. So we're not going to be too particular about the time, but we do want to honor those of you that have to end at 5 o'clock by covering the main ground by 5 o'clock. Let me introduce the panel to you firstly and tell you who we have on the panel, and then I'll tell you how the day is going to work. So as I said, we've got a great panel, 3 speakers, all of whom are in industry. So firstly, in no particular order, we have Catherine Lukhoff, who's the co-founder and chief executive officer of 2020-50. They specialize in modern application development, serverless cloud computing, and artificial intelligence. They pride themselves on working with smart, interesting people and companies who value problem solving and innovation as a way to meaningfully contribute to the collective future. Catherine, in her career, has been named one of the Mail and Guardian's 200 Young South Africans. She was recognized for top woman in business and government. She featured in the Old Mutual Do Great Things Startup Guide, Destiny Magazine's Power of 40 Under 40, and named as one of South African women making it big in tech by Fin24. So absolutely someone that has practical experience that we'd love to hear. Our second guest today is Archana Arakal, and she's the practice lead for the Intelligent Data Division at Synthesis. She joined Synthesis in June 2018, bringing with her 4 years of experience in product engineering, cloud, research and development, product implementation, and so on. And her current focus is on artificial intelligence, particularly artificial intelligence education and responsibly getting AI systems into production. She's recognized for her AI expertise in the financial, mining, and research sectors. She holds a master's in electrical and electronic engineering and is currently affiliated with a few research groups and various universities. She holds numerous certifications and specialities, including in big data, security, machine learning, and Amazon Web Services. Finally, to make up our trio of speakers, we have Houston Mazamindo. He studied a BSc in computational and applied maths at WITS. During his second year at WITS, he founded IQmates, which is an edtech startup, which provides supplementary revision resources in the form of videos and discussion groups and practice questions and so on to help students test and track their understanding. To grow his startup, he did his postgraduate diploma in management at Wits Business School in 2016, where he graduated with a distinction and the top of the class. From there, he joined Investec in 2017 in their analytics consulting team. And part of his mandate is to implement AI use cases in the private bank in support of the business's high-touch efforts. He enjoys all sorts of things like exploring the outdoors and teaching others, but for example, specifically using AI to help teach and get Investec and people to get ahead of the curve. So those are our speakers. I will give them an opportunity to speak very shortly. So the way it's going to run today is I'm going to give each of the speakers 5 to 7 minutes or so to sort of lay out their stall, so to speak, to make a few opening comments on what they have learned with regard to practical applications of AI, and also to touch on the question of the webinar, which is it relevant to all industries, or are some industries more geared towards using and exploiting it than others? After they've each had their initial conversation, we will then move into the question and answers. So please do keep posting your questions in the chat pane. After they've all done their opening address, we'll then move into the time of questions. And then about 10 minutes before the end, we'll start wrapping up and ask each of them again to reflect on the conversation that we've had this afternoon. So that's the way it's going to work. Thanks again for the opportunity. And without further ado, in the order that I introduced them, Catherine, would you like to get the ball rolling?
Absolutely. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the introduction. It's really a pleasure to be on a panel with Archie and Houston. It's lovely to see you. And Brian, thank you for facilitating. And thanks to everyone else for making some time to be here today. So I guess I'll launch right in. Brian did ask us to put an opening statement together, and there are a few things I feel quite strongly about. But let's lay the groundwork. So essentially, algorithms now inform the decisions we make, from the seemingly inconsequential to having a really profound and direct impact on our lives. And as business executives, I think that's really important to remember and to understand and to really think about if we're going to be considering applying AI in our businesses. So just a few short years ago, we were using AI for song and movie recommendations, but nowadays, it dictates and actually defines whether you're getting a home loan or a job, or what route you're taking to work, or what your insurance premium will be. So the truth is that it's being applied ubiquitously and more so, and it's often in a way that we don't even see. I think it's useful to frame AI in two particular buckets, one being software. So if you think of virtual assistants, image analysis software, search engines, speech recognition, facial recognition, and so forth. And then embodied AI, which is around robots, autonomous cars, drones, Internet of Things, and so forth. So as for the use of the kind of the growth across industries and the application thereof, there's no doubt that there are benefits, right? There's cost saving, better insights into your data, better customer service, although I myself have been very frustrated by a few customer service bots in the past and probably in the future. But it's really important to consider the ethical issues associated with the implementation of AI and the role that we as humans play in ensuring that that power is wielded responsibly. In other words, how do we elevate the roles of humans in the decision-making processes? And that for me is a fundamental starting point of understanding whether you should or could apply AI in your business. So you have to think of it as a new set of working relationships, essentially. So AI's ability to manage more complex tasks is growing at pace. And at the same time, we need to guard against this magical thinking that AI can do everything and we overestimate its ability and essentially what it is capable of doing in our business. The truth of the matter is AI is not human. It doesn't feel pain or shame or guilt, doesn't have any remorse. You cannot meaningfully sanction it. I mean, how do you punish an AI? And there's some very interesting thought experiments there on, could you be friends with an AI? Or could an AI be curious? Or, can an AI be compassionate? And so in the systems that we built, kind of this notion around human accountability. So think of executive boards and governments. This is not a trivial concern, as AI is given more and more work to do within the environments we work and play in. Secondly, this idea of what do we know, whether we know what the ethical position of an AI should be is also really tricky, right? What do you train it on? For example, are you going to decide that the ethical worldview should be a Christian perspective or an Islamic perspective or a Confucius perspective? How do we reach a consensus globally about what that ethical framework should be? It's really important to perhaps look at the Montreal AI Ethics Institute. They've just released their latest report on ethics in AI. It was published in January 2021. It's a long read, so you better be ready for it, but it's worth considering. So I want to get real about the here and now, because those are very big topics of conversation. And I want to reference something that the team in the UK have done under the leadership of Robbie Stamp called BIOS. And it's essentially a framework to ask questions to define how can you manage risk, potentially avoid harmful liabilities, and kind of maximize the benefits and also the opportunities. So there are 5 questions. And the first is, would the work in your organization, would the AI work in your organization in an advisory capacity? Does it leave space for human judgment and decision-making, and whether a human can decide what advice the AI should or shouldn't give? So what advisory role can it play? Secondly, have you granted that AI authority to consciously or unconsciously over other human beings? So think of an Uber driver. Their lives are dictated by algorithms. So what does it mean to be managed by algorithm? And has your HR department even considered that? What are the rights of the workers being managed by AI, for example? The third question, one I'm quite passionate about, is what agency have you granted the AI, if any, to commit resources without there being a human in the loop? So can the AI spend money on behalf of your company? Can it trade stocks and shares, which I'm sure Robinhood knows something about? And can it write its own code or have give advice to customers without a human actually ever participating in that process? The fourth, and there are only 5, so I'm almost done, is what do we abdicate to an AI and when and in what circumstances? So consider driverless cars. All of them are still telling you that the driver, although not driving, should always keep their hands close or near the steering wheel. But after 100 hours of being driven around, how attentive are you really going to be? And think of a doctor in a surgical situation where an AI is involved in the operation, and the doctor has one course of action, the AI has another, and there's a minute to decide on whether to save someone's life. Do you abdicate to the AI, or do you as the doctor have the sole responsibility to make the final decision? And then finally, what are the lines of accountability? So are they clear? And this is a really critical question that underpins all of the above, so the advisory, authority, agency, and abdication. You can't fire an AI, right? So if they've screwed up, who's responsible? And if they start acting unethically, for example, outside of the scope of law, how do you deal with that? In essence, I think if you wanted to sum it up, it's what is the work we're asking AI to do within relation to our strategy and our business values? Whether or not it should or could be applied, I guess, is no longer up for debate. There are certainly industries in which it's more applicable than others. And I know we're going to get to some use cases in the future or later on in this conversation. But I think it's really important that for anyone engaging in the space to educate themselves on what the impact will be. And I hope that we can cover that a bit more in this conversation. So thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, Catherine. just to get you thinking about a question that I'm going to ask as a follow-up when we come back to Q&A. Sixth question I have for you. Once you implement AI in an organization, is it the realm of IT or the CIO organization to make it work and keep it working? Or is an AI a bit like a person? It is doing a job in a department, and line management therefore needs to own, manage, and be responsible for the robot. Let me leave you to think on that one while we move on. So Archie, over to you. You can talk to us for a few minutes about your opening thoughts.
Great, thanks, Brian. It's always an honor to be on the same panel as Catherine Hoston as well. And I love the questions you brought up actually with regards to ethics. It's always a concern that we do have to address. Whenever I'm on a panel like this, something that I'm always reminded by is actually one of my first experiences deploying an AI model into the industry. And it started off with, I was super excited about deploying this generative algorithm. We ended up creating this amazing image sequencing system where we could actually see a perfect visual from a non-perfect visual. And I was super excited. It took me a year to actually design the entire system. But I came back home and I was telling my family so proudly about how amazing this work was. I told my brother and he came to me and he was like, so essentially you took a whole year to design something that I could put together in Paint. Is that what you're telling me? So essentially, after that one topic, I was livid because I spent my entire year just putting all of this together, and he just basically shattered all my dreams. And secondly, it made me realize one thing, that just because you have AI doesn't necessarily mean you should be using it in any business use case. It's extremely useful to be able to understand what sort of use case you're tackling. And once you've actually understood what sort of use case you're tackling, there are so many moving components that you need to take into account. Something that I always actually bring up when I'm actually talking about the machine learning lifecycle or the AI lifecycle is machine learning is 10% of the problem. The larger part of the problem is the people element. It's the organization element. It's the privacy element, which I'm sure everyone has encountered, especially due to the WhatsApp privacy story, as well as being able to understand whether your environment is actually ready. Is your environment ready to handle AI? Is your environment actually suitable for AI? Is your business use case actually what can be solved by AI? So once you've actually tackled all those problems, you actually, most of the time you find that, no, I don't actually need AI. Or you find that, well, I'm not really ready for AI and maybe I need to actually put some steps in place. And this is where the realm of data engineering comes into play. This is where the realm of privacy comes into play. Because as much as you have all this AI technology in the world, the reality is we need to get to a state of maturity in order to actually leverage these technologies. I do, however, need to mention that the reason why AI has become such a hype now is because we're actually getting closer and closer to being able to leverage these technologies. So if we're to look at cloud compute, it's amazing the amount of processing speed we have. It's amazing how we can actually store our data these days in comparison to much late in the years. And that's why AI has actually become a hype now, because we can actually do something about it. Look at our Siris, look at our Teslas, look at our Alexas. All of that computation would not have been possible 20, 30 years ago. We are now getting closer and closer to the point where we're ready for it. But just because we're ready for it doesn't mean that we should be slapping it in every single solution. Just to drop that in the mic as well. So, and that's one of the components that we need to consider, the environment readiness. And the second part, and this is actually, Catherine touched on this quite a few times with regards to ethics. A second part is also, is your workforce ready? Is your workforce actually ready to handle this, this workload that's coming up, this new way of working within your environment? Is HR ready? Is your actual engineers ready? There's so many different components that you need to upskill to that point before you can actually just drop the bomb of AI on them. And the second component is privacy. We're all talking about bringing the most cutting edge algorithms into the mix, but has anyone actually ever thought about the data implications around this? Has anyone actually taken a look at the POPI and the GDPR and the SARB regulations that we actually have to consider before we can actually put any algorithms into place? I have to drop this into the mix, but something that we're doing from a research perspective is looking at new ways of creating machine learning models, not necessarily using the traditional way of taking an entire data set from consumers, which is and rather let's reverse the approach. Let's reverse the approach and let's actually take a machine learning model and the AI solution to the user themselves. It's a concept called federated learning. So have we considered those options? Why are we trying to utilize the old ways of doing things? Why not, if we are going to be looking at cutting edge technology, should we not find a balance between the two? So that's a couple of my thoughts. I can probably carry on talking about this for ages, but essentially that's essentially what I have to talk about, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Excellent. Thanks, Archie. I think what you did there is you gave us a sort of a primer for a number of the questions that are already in the chat pane. For example, where to start, where to focus on, where to prioritize first, but also, do we have the right infrastructure and enabling conditions in South Africa, and what are the inhibitors there? So we'll come to those questions. Last but by no means least, Houston, you have the floor, good man.
Yeah. Thanks, Professor, and hello, everyone. I do agree with everything that Catherine and Archie have said. So mine might be a bit shorter because they've touched on almost everything. But what I would say is I usually do this thought experiment where I think of any industry and I think of a use case for AI. The honest truth is, I think in every single industry, there is a use case. But like what Archie said, it depends. When you think about it, let's think about sporting. It doesn't mean that every single use case in sports needs AI. That's where now you need to analyze, is this use case relevant for me to use AI or not? But every single industry, I think, it benefit from AI. For the example, like the example I gave now, when you're talking about soccer, there's no need for a referee to be there when you want to analyze whether a goal, whether the ball is past the goal line or not. AI can do that. But now you have to ask, is it relevant for me to do it? So every single industry has use cases for AI, I think. My thought experiment, I haven't come across any industry where there is not even a single use case. But the other thing that when I do some presentations or when I write my articles, many people ask, why now? Why are people talking about AI now? I think Archie touched a bit on that, where it's mostly, I think I have like 4 reasons. The first one is we have more computing power right now. I think the cell phone that we have, if you look at your iPhone is more computing power than the rocket that sent people to the moon. So we actually have a very, very powerful computer in our hands, all of us. So that computing power is enabling us to do so many different things when it comes to AI. And then the second one is more data. I think when you read on statistics that were released when it comes to data, there's, I think it's said nearly 90% of the data that has ever been generated by humans ever was generated in the previous 2 years, which is crazy to think about. Imagine from way back then, thousands of years ago, 90% of the data was generated in the previous 2 years, with I think close to 2 quintillion bytes of data being generated every single day. I know, like WhatsApp, we send a total of like 30 billion WhatsApp messages a day or something like that. So the data that we're generating is enabling AI, because AI, it depends on data, right? You train it on data. The more data you have, the better it is. So computing power, more data, and then better algorithms is the third one. Back then, it was so difficult to do image processing or image classification. But I think around 2008, there was a team that developed a better algorithm to figure out, is this a cat or is this a dog? I think that's where they started. Like figuring out, you just put up a picture and then the AI algorithm is able to tell whether it's a cat or a dog. And from there, better and better algorithms are developed. Up to now, Tesla can use its cameras and can tell this is a stop sign, this is a robot and stuff. So better algorithms, that's the third one. And then the fourth one that I can say is broad investments. There are companies that are heavily investing in AI development because they depend on it. For example, Facebook, when you have, I think it was from the stats, but that was like maybe 2014, 2015, they were saying a single person, a single user of Facebook, they get on their news feed 1,500 posts every single day. It's so difficult for Facebook, and now with 2 billion users, multiply that by 2 billion users, it's so difficult for Facebook to put human power into maintaining the integrity of the platform, to make sure that the videos that are being uploaded are not harmful videos, you know? So they've invested heavily in AI algorithms because they depend on it to make some decisions. When you upload a video, the AI algorithm can analyze the video. Is there violence in this video? And then can flag it, you know. So those broad investments are helping us push AI forward. And so now I think it is a technology whose time has come, pretty much. But it is not a new technology. If we say it's a new technology, it would be disingenuous to say it's a new technology. The principles were laid in the 50s by people like Alan Turing. They laid the principles back then. But now I think all these factors are coming together to make it much viable. And if you look at, I think it's called the Gartner hype cycle of emerging technologies, there's that peak where you have inflated expectations right there. You think AI is going to solve all your problems, but actually not. And then but we are still close to the peak. We are still at the peak here. We're going to be disappointed by some of what's going to happen, like when you discover that, oh no, actually this use case doesn't really need AI. It probably just needs normal analytics, not AI. Until we finally figure out where to properly use AI. But I'll leave it there. I'll answer some of the questions that I've seen. Some of them are quite interesting. For example, the one that was put up around South Africa not having the infrastructure for AI. And in the future, I'll talk about it later, but things like edge AI. There's lots of research in edge AI, but I'll leave it there for now, Professor.
Excellent. Thanks, Houston. So AI is a technology whose time has come. And it's actually interesting, the point you make. When I did my PhD back in the dark ages in 1990, we were already trying to look at neural networks for the application I was studying. But we never had the computing power, we never had the data, we never had the algorithms, and we never had the ecosystems. So it was a theory, but it wasn't a practice. And I think now we are on the cusp of turning theory into practice. So the way I propose to do this from now is we have a lot of questions. So I'm going to sort of pose 3 questions at a time, and any of you can pick up whichever one you want. And I will nudge you if we don't have any takers on any of the questions. So let's start off with sort of with 3 questions, which sort of talk to the basics. The first is from Naheem and Darren, I think. What is the distinction between AI and just using smart algorithms? Where's the boundary, and where's South Africa actually at in the distinction? So the example I always like to think of is an airplane's autopilot. It's an incredibly complex thing using very complex algorithms, and it's very smart, and it flies better than a human being in many cases, but it doesn't learn. It's not really AI. So that's the question on what's the boundary and where is the current frontier in South Africa. The second question, before we get on to possibilities, let's talk about inhibitors. And in South Africa, what are the inhibitors? And I think Sachaba mentioned is our poor data infrastructure and the concerns around data, the internet in South Africa. Is that a problem? How much of a problem is it? And secondly, are there other inhibitors in terms of the infrastructure and arguably skills? And the third question coming in, I think, was from Eden and some others. Where do we start? If we're in an organization, what are the things that we should really start to build momentum, show progress, and move forward? So who wants to go first?
I would be happy to pick up on the first one around, I guess everyone can Google the definition of AI, but essentially what is it? Where do you draw the line between, as you rightly say, Brian, automation, autopilot, for example, and AI? One could probably argue that autopilot in airplanes now actually includes AI, especially if you think of some of the security features included in cars already actually are AI driven, yet we don't necessarily have autonomous vehicles yet. There are some very good use cases and examples of that. I think the best way to think about it, and it's interesting, I had the same discussion with a friend on a walk this weekend. His view is that AI shouldn't be something that a human can also do. Whereas I believe that if you can simulate the way a human thinks and reasons and do it better with more data, that would be the definition of AI. So one could argue, is a search algorithm AI, yes or no? And then similarly, you can start looking at applications like, or in contrast, I should say, you can start looking at applications such as DeepMind's AlphaFold, where we're starting to solve problems around protein folding that can have really big impact in terms of healthcare and treatments and so forth in the future. I don't believe that humans have the capacity to take in as much data as machine learning algorithms do, for example. And therefore, my definition always is could you train an algorithm to do what a human does, but more so better and faster? And in that way, I mean, this opens up a whole conversation around transparency and how do we define what an algorithm is doing and how do we hold them accountable for that? But for me, it really boils down to, is this a way in which we can simulate human reasoning? And I'm not going to touch consciousness, but human reasoning and the application of that. And can we use it to reach breakthroughs and do better work? If one takes an example of text recognition, the ability to do discovery in a lawsuit, you know, where it may have taken you years to work through a set of files to reach a court trial and be able to argue your position as a lawyer, you're now able to do that in a matter of days using algorithms. And so, yes, the human could do it, but an algorithm is doing it better. Perhaps Archie and Houston have an add-on for that.
Yeah, I can add on. Okay.
Okay, so yeah, actually, I do agree with your definition, Catherine. There's definitely, I think there is a area where algorithms can definitely outperform human reasoning, and that comes down to the availability of data and the availability of compute. So, I mean, you touched on a very interesting point around the legal space. Previously, who knows how many anomalies have been undetected, but now because we have the capacity and we have the computation as well as the data sets to actually help us create algorithms to understand those anomalies, that is actually a function of AI. That is the whole document understanding solution. That is a function of AI. And that's something that we have now as opposed to before. So yes, there's definitely that distinction between what AI can do and what just a standard algorithm can do.
Yeah, and just to add on there, I think another very important distinction is what Professor said in passing, that AI learns. It learns over time. Most of those smart algorithms that maybe that might be doing like autopilot and stuff like that, they are not learning. But AI, the more data you feed it, the more it learns new trends and stuff like that. So it discovers new trends. But the normal smart algorithms that are driving our planes, they are not learning. They're just doing what they're programmed to do. But AI can actually discover new ways of doing things just by learning through learning by itself. So that's another very important distinction there.
Thanks, guys. Anyone want to have a go on some of the current inhibitors that are holding back the more widespread application of AI in the business place?
And maybe take a go at that. Mm-hmm. So just from experience, the biggest inhibitors have been infrastructure as well as the capacity and capability within organizations in South Africa. But having said that, I don't think this is something that is true it's not a standard across every single industry. I feel there are certain pockets that are more mature than others. So it's about finding those more mature elements that actually doesn't have these inhibitors. And to be completely honest, with things like cloud compute and with things like the internet, we're not too far behind. We just need to be able to find these resources and actually shape up our organizations in order to be more accepting of these concepts. So as much as there are inhibitors out there, I think what's actually missing is the thought leadership around this element and being able to transform an organization to be more accepting of these concepts. Because from an infrastructure point of view, there's definitely cloud computing. From a data point of view, there are always data sets. Yes, I can argue the cleanliness and the quality of the data, but we have methods in place to ensure that we can get more high quality of data. So yes, there are different ways we can actually go about solving this problem, but it starts with the thought process. It starts with being able to adopt these mindsets as well.
Thanks.
Yeah.
If I could jump in very briefly, I think one of the biggest inhibitors is fear and a lack of understanding. It seems to be, I mean, AI has been around for decades, right? It's become this hype word and it has so many connotations to it, like machines are going to take my job. It truly doesn't have to be. There's so much power and collective intelligence around how humans and machines, for want of a better description, work together. And I think the big thing often, and certainly in the work we've done when we encounter clients who say they want to consider it, but they don't really know where to start, is you don't have to build Rome in a day. There's so many ways to prototype to understand whether it's possible, whether AI would even be a good application to help solve the problem you're dealing with. And as Archie mentioned in her opening statement, you might find it's not. But the truth is everything you want lies on the other side of fear. And that doesn't mean be gung-ho and go out there and apply AI to everything. But certainly don't be afraid of trying it or educating yourself on it. And there's enough literature out there and Coursera courses to get you started that are free of charge that really do an amazing job of educating or kind of learning more about what's possible.
Thanks.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, for me, I think some of the factors I think those are the umbrella reasons. Because when Catherine talked about fear, it's also fear of management. Like, what does this really mean? And fear of employees themselves. Is it going to take my job and stuff? Or what Archie say, we might not have the skills in our organizations to implement some of these things. But change management is one of them. It's a huge one where you need to really, really sit down with even up to the board level for them to understand what exactly you are doing. Because many people think AI, which means we do not need humans anymore. Actually, humans are very much needed in that loop. Right now, you cannot just put for many cases, you cannot just put an algorithm and leave it to do whatever it does. You still need humans to be very, very involved in that loop. So and obviously other challenges like technology challenges whereby maybe your in-house infrastructure is not ready for you to support AI. Now those legacy issues will come into play. Do you store your data in a database or it's still on Excel files? So some of those legacy issues actually play a huge role as inhibitors. Yeah.
Thanks, guys. So we haven't yet really touched on where to start, but let me use that remaining part of the question to segue into the next set. So we do need to know as an organization where to start. What are the things to look for in a business process or an activity that suggested is going to be benefit significantly from AI as opposed to RPA or just traditional IT business process implementation. So that would be the first part of the question. The second part is, where are some examples that you've seen that it has really, let's get real, some examples, case studies that you've seen it has really been transformative on the one hand, whereas on the other hand, where it has actually been disappointing or a failure, and what can we learn from that? And then I want to move from there into the impact on people and this whole idea of cooperation versus competition between machines and people, using AI as a tool in the one narrative versus AI is going to take our jobs in the other narrative. So the relationship between people and machines. And the final point on that, which I personally feel very strongly about, is where does the human touch fit into this? I was speaking to the chief executive of one of our big banks. I shared with you last time we chatted. And he was saying he thinks the differentiating factor between a bank, the big banks going forwards, is going to be purely on the humanness of their customer engagement. Obviously, thick backends, fantastic business processes that are completely seamless and work all the time, and great products. But those are almost going to be taken as given. And the difference will be, does the bank make you feel like a real person? So how does AI dovetail with that? So I've thrown out a barrage of questions there. Someone must be brave and go first.
I'm happy to go first.
Okay, cool.
You know why? Because it's easier if you get your point across, as Houston found, that by the time you get to the end, everyone's pointed out your point or made your point. I'd like to start with the use cases. And the reason I want to start with the use cases that work is because actually looking at use cases for how to apply, looking at a use case first and foremost is the first step in understanding whether you should or shouldn't apply AI. And therefore understanding what good use cases are and which aren't, I think is a good starting point. So let me use the example of a bot. Everyone's familiar with a bot. I'm sure I've mentioned it before. We've all had customer service bot engagements. I'm not necessarily a fan. And in fact, if anyone wants to, here's a quick hack for you. If you ever want to get past a bot, you just have to swear at it and you hope that there's a human in the loop that will start, linking you straight through to the human. But I'll use an example of a bot that we're building. So it's a Lex-powered NLP tool for one of the largest retailers in the country. And so their current behavior is that every single day they get reams and reams and reams of Excel sheets that are emailed to them, off which they are supposed to be making decisions. KPI sales, or a year-on-year growth, or what were the milk sales for a particular store in a particular area. The bot we're building essentially picks up both on intent and also executes very specific queries that are related to their business, but then also allow them to ask questions in different ways and helps them reach a decision or access information faster. It's like a front door to their data. No external user is ever going to touch it. It's very specific to the utterances they need, but it essentially allows them to move away from the Excel spreadsheets, although those are there in backup and sit in their data lake, but allow them to access that information. We built the initial prototype in 6 weeks, and our goal was, can we prove whether we can use Lex, an AWS tool, to actually to recognize intent, whether I ask a question or not, and then execute a query. Off the back of that, we did some testing and they came back and they went, great, Lex works, let's build this out into a production tool. At which point you start building out all the use cases it could be used for, what all the product requirements are, and you followed exactly the same process that you would if you're building any other product. In this case, you just happen to be using NLP to help power that bot. So I think that, as Archie so rightly pointed out, there are ways, people seem to think that they have to add AI to everything. This is not MSG, right? It might taste good, but it's not always good for you. And so if you can understand what the use case is that your business, what's the problem you're trying to solve? And if you have the right people around you, whether it's your CTO or your data analyst or your marketing person or your chief innovation officer who understands the technology that's out there that you can harness, ask them, go and look at what other companies are doing. Start thinking outside of the box and thinking, are there tools I can use that may already exist that I could use a prototype for and then potentially custom build around that? And like I said, you can do very quick go, no-go decisions by just prototyping. I'll let the experts speak and keep my mouth shut now.
Cool. I can go. I can go.
No, you can go.
Cool. All right. So, Catherine, you actually stole my point, but essentially, it actually goes around the same sort of framework that you're referring to as well. It always starts with a good use case. I actually always say start with a hard problem. Start with a problem that no one can solve. And actually, I think there's a very interesting use case that's on our website around email routing, which is essentially there was a huge inbox that needed to route all these emails just to different people, but like it wasn't classified well enough, it wasn't routed well enough, it wasn't tagged well enough, there was no intent classification on it. So there was essentially an entire algorithm, an entire product that was built to kind of start routing these emails around. And that tends to give a faster turnaround. I think it was close to 6 times faster than what it originally started off as. So, I mean, you can probably read the use case on our Synthesis website, but essentially that's a key use case of how you could go about how a hard problem could be solved with AI. And that was actually just machine learning. It is machine learning, solving it with actual data and classifying that data and ensuring that you can create patterns from there. Another use case that is completely on the opposite spectrum of all of this is profiling. Profiling people, being able to understand what it is that people need. So this is something that is in the GovChat realm. It's another project that I'm working on, but being able to understand where vulnerable people are sitting currently. Where do they need help? How is it that we can actually look at a specific region and see what is necessary in that area? That is that is obviously a clustering problem, but in order to have that sort of data available, and by providing a government with that sort of data set, we're essentially enabling the government to understand what citizens actually need. So that's another very interesting way of being able to use AI, and that's actually more analytics. It's not even true AI, if I may say. It's actually not even true AI. It's literally a matter of just looking at what people are reporting on, looking at what people are saying, and being able to give the government that information. Then I think maybe something that is actually true AI is something that I built in the mining sector around autonomous vehicles. So essentially what happened here was we actually had to create a self-driving vehicle in the industry to be able to navigate very like dark tunnels. So in order to actually get the vehicles to drive in that area, we actually had to create a self-driving vehicle, which is actually true. And it took a long time. It took a very, very long time. And it was not easy. We had to go through several compliance and health regulatory councils, but eventually it actually got into production, and we're able to reduce the health risk in that area by 67%. And that is a crazy amount of people's lives that we were able to save just by using AI in that solution. So it comes down to a hard problem, I think. It really comes down to a hard problem, understanding the domain in which you're working with. And we always mention, let's keep the human in the loop, but something that is also quite critical is to keep the knowledge in the loop as well. Because something I'm actually finding in the healthcare sector in specific is there's two different areas we're looking at. We have, let's say, for example, we have the doctors that have all this information and have all this knowledge that has been gathering around. And then we have the techies. We have the techies that are busy building all these algorithms and not really bringing the knowledge together. Because if we combine the domain experts as well as the technical guys, we actually can build something great. So that's essentially, I think I spoke a lot, but that's essentially what it comes down to and what I've seen from experience.
Yeah, I agree completely again. I think all the points that everyone is raising, they are very valid points. From my side, I think when I'm deciding whether a use case needs AI or not, it is a task that needs thinking. Like if a human can do it, maybe AI can do it, because AI is aimed at sort of like simulating what a human can do. But then the thing is, should a human do it? For example, let me give you a classic example at work here at Investec, right? What we have the global support center, where we have telephone bankers. So you can call in if you have any query and stuff. So those telephone bankers, they receive hundreds of thousands of calls every single month. And just like any support center, right? You need to make sure that the quality is up. You don't want to slack. Otherwise, you're dealing with clients and stuff like that. So, but to maintain that quality, to do quality assurance on hundreds of thousands of calls is incredibly difficult, because you cannot do that manually. How many people would you need to listen to all those calls? It will be difficult. So we implemented a voice analytics software that is powered by AI algorithms that are like voice recognition, that transcribe what's being said on a call to text. So by doing that, a human can do it, but then should a human do it? No, I think it would be impossible for them to do it. So what then happened is, instead of just doing 0.1% quality assurance on the calls, now you can do 100%, because there is the AI algorithm that's checking, is there any shouting on the call? Is it a complaint call? And you can do it automatically by itself. Or are people speaking on top of each other? So you can rate all those things and actually classify what the call is about. It's very, very difficult to do it. It is. If it's a call, it is possible for a human to do it, but at scale, it's impossible. So that's where you then put in AI to simulate what a human could have done. I think all financial companies, I think they do credit checks, right? That's where AI also can work. I think someone in the comments asked, what about in financial services? Financial services, that's a use case that I think every bank works on, where it's like credit checks. If you receive millions of applications, again, it might be difficult for you, like let's say a Standard Bank, to go through each and every application manually. What they can do is employ machine learning, an algorithm that can decide your credit rating. And the algorithm will be like, no, I think, yeah, maybe this person, we should give them a loan of this much and not this much, And that brings in another question that's being asked there in the chat when it comes to bias. That is a topic that I'm very passionate about, because like the person said there, when you start applying these algorithms, there's bias that's going to be involved, because you're training them on previous data. So if the data that you have is not representative of what's currently there, you're going to introduce some of those errors. I think Amazon is a famous example. Everyone talks about Amazon, where they use the AI algorithm to put up adverts for jobs. But then what then ended up happening was the AI algorithm only showed developer jobs, like coding jobs, to white males, and not to any other, not to females, not to any like black people or any other race. It was just to white males. It's because when they trained that AI algorithm based on their previous hires, most of their hires for the coding jobs were just white males. So some of those things, those are things that it was just to answer one of the questions that is there in the chat. So yeah, for us, our CSC and the credit.
Thanks, Houston. So, I mean, there was one question for me actually, which let me quickly answer. It says, has WITS been using AI to do predictive analysis on student success rate? And the answer to that is, in a way, yes. But no. So all the lecturers do that, and the lecturers pretend to be intelligent. So that's the way we are using artificial intelligence to predict student success rate. But seriously, we have nominally 10 minutes left. As I said, we can go over, but there's a barrage of questions that we need to do. So I want to change this into a game. We're going to play 30 seconds, right? So you have 30 seconds for any answer. So the challenge is to get your point across. Houston ended off with the point on bias. So let me just throw out a number of the concerns that are often raised. The one is algorithmic bias, or that we build bias into AI. And I would say, well, human beings are by and large biased. So the more perfect AI gets, will it not become more biased to reflect human-like bias? But what can we do? Secondly, a lot of questions always with AI around ethics, and particularly some of the questions that Catherine asked up front. The ethics of what do you empower AI to do and what do you not empower it to do? And of course, the sort of the singularity thought is, do you empower it to improve itself, to start that spiral? Thirdly, the impact on people. And we'll come back to, maybe we'll come back to that in a final segment, is, you know, what do you see as the impact on jobs? Fourthly, do we have the legal frameworks in South Africa, or is there a lot of catching up to do in terms of, let's call it the legal infrastructure, both from, you know, the Department of Digital Communication and Digital Services in terms of the domain-specific regulation, but also general legal foundations, are they in place? And then, yeah, that's probably a good place to throw at you now. There are a few technical questions in the pane, which I'd like to see if we've got a chance, but let's have a go at those for the next 5 minutes. Your 30 seconds starts now.
Okay.
Okay.
You can each have a few 30-second slots, by the way.
Okay, I think for me, where the question around, do we have the legal infrastructure in SA? I think that one is a challenge for all countries. Some countries are actually putting together, like I think at the World Economic Forum, there's a dedicated body looking at AI ethics. And there's actually a head of AI ethics at the World Economic Forum. You can follow her on LinkedIn. I think her name is Catherine Butterfield, if I'm not mistaken, but just Google her. And she posts all these white papers that they write. It's not just a South African issue, it's a worldwide issue. But here in South Africa, President Ramaphosa put together that group of people that is looking at fourth industrial revolution technologies and all of that. So I bet those people are also thinking about the legal infrastructure in SA.
Cool.
Go, Archie.
Okay.
Bias.
30 seconds, bias. Okay. So essentially, I think with bias in specific, we need to cater for inclusivity. It is something obviously that we haven't really catered for. And so what's happening is the more mature we're getting, we're actually starting to include more inclusive data sets. And yes, it is baked into a lot of the algorithms, it's baked into a lot of data sets, but there are techniques to actually include other data sets and to ensure that we are catering for a larger population. I think that's 30 seconds.
Is it, if I may, is it if we just use the right training data, and we are very mindful of the training data that we use, that the problem is largely solved, or is there much more to it than that?
There is other components you need to cater for, because it starts with the problem framing to start with. If you want your algorithm to answer a very biased problem, that's the first point of entry of including bias. If you make sure that you ask a very inclusive question, then That's obviously one aspect that's solved for. Then the second component would be the data sets that you're trying to train your algorithm with as well. That's obviously the next component. Then the third component is how do you cater in feedback? That's something that we always forget, because as much as we have an algorithm that's trained and is in production, we need to constantly keep updating that. And if we don't update that, we'll have a drift in our models and we won't have an algorithm that's inclusive anymore. So there's quite a few components. I can probably speak about it for ages, but no one's going to get a chance to speak. But those are the three main ones.
Thanks. Catherine,
I would also add to that. Sorry,
Okay.
we're talking over each other. I would add to that also, how do you define success and how do you test for that success? Because at the end of the day, it might be the same set of people framing the question, training the algorithm, who are also trying to define success. So if you consider, for example, Google's search algorithm, it is very successful for Google, but for the user, I'm not so sure. So do I know that the thing I've searched for is the thing that I actually wanted to land on, or did I only land on it because Google decided it was the best thing for me to land on? And I mean, that opens a whole data economy question, but how do you define success? And at what point does the company itself define the success of whether or not their tool they've built is biased or not? And I think the ultimate responsibility lies with big boards of executives who have to make that decision as to whether those tools going out and are consumer facing have bias or don't have bias, and how they would mitigate against that. And if you're not doing that, you shouldn't be working with AI.
Okay. Okay. A narrow question on people, then a broader question on people. The narrow question on people: what, in your view, are the current sort of golden rules or rules of thumb about when AI should be allowed to be autonomous, or when human approval is required or human oversight? The broader, that's the narrow question. Think about that for 10 seconds. The broader question will be the impact on jobs and what should we do about that? How big will it be and what should we do? But we'll come back to that. Let's firstly talk about human in the loop.
For us, our decision there rests on the impact that the algorithm has. So if there's a financial impact, because of course we're a bank, right? If there's a financial impact, we definitely need a human to be involved in the decision making. Like I think Catherine in the beginning, she was talking about should the AI spend your money? Can you decide that? But if it's Netflix that is suggesting movies for me, there's really not much negative impact there. It's just suggesting maybe the things that I like watching, like sci-fi. But if there's real tangible impact, like financial wise or bodily harm or something, I think a human needs to be involved in the decision making.
So Houston, what happens if a Netflix algorithm suggests a series called 13 Ways to Die or 13 Days to Die? I can't remember the series name. And it's presented to a very vulnerable teenager. So that begs the question that, yes, you might think that it is an easy, not very impactful use case, but yet it could be. And I guess that's the thing around how do you ensure that there are rigorous structures around every single application of it that is defined by the same set of rules, and that those initial rules are considered not just from one viewpoint, but from as many viewpoints as you can possibly collate. So just being a devil's advocate.
Detour from where I was going. So in that case, where does the liability lie? Is the liability with the AI programmer? Is the liability with the AI programmer's boss? Is the liability with the consumer? You would just wake up and manage your life. When tech goes wrong, I guess there's a broader question, not narrowly limited to AI, but in this case, what is the role of the firm, the manager, versus the AI programmer and implementer, and where does liability lie?
That's a deep question. You're right. It's a broader discussion. Like, for example, I think there's that MIT experiment where it was a self-driving car. If a self-driving car is going down the road and then there's a grandmother on the road, should it swerve and kill the passenger, or should it run over the person who's in the road? So some of those discussions are actually philosophical discussions that people are grappling with right now. Like, who's in charge when AI goes wrong? I don't know, Archie, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, so essentially, it is quite a broad discussion, and a lot of it can be philosophical, a lot of it can be technical. But I mean, sitting in the technical front of things and having to actually implement these sort of solutions, you kind of actually deal with a predicament on your hand, because you're being told to actually build these solutions out. You want to actually have the experience to build it out. But at the same time, there's obviously a knock-on effect. There's a knock-on effect, and you are directly impacting someone's life. So what I'd like to bring up is AI ethics is no different from software ethics and technology ethics as a whole, right? At every single point, there is a risk mitigation strategy that needs to be taken into account, and AI is no different. We do always need to think about the broader spectrum of things, and this is where the concept of inclusivity is so important, because if we only look at a very small demographic, I keep thinking about the hand sanitizer example, where hand sanitizers was initially only designed for one particular skin type. What happened eventually was it obviously didn't cater for a larger market. And that's a very simple example. But imagine in the case of, for example, the self-driving car. What if the self-driving car does not actually take a human being into account, like a human with different colors into account? That's actually a higher risk than the hand sanitizer example. So we always do need to think of from different angles and see, okay, if we are going to be employing the solution in place, what are the different points of entry that this needs to go to, and what are the effects that it has on those people? And this is the same for the job market as well, being able to understand that if we are going to be deploying the system, what sort of measures do we need to put in place to upskill the people who are currently doing that job? What should we actually do to enforce education? And that, I think, we're not 100% there yet, and it's something we do need to actually think about.
So let me, on the ethical thing, there's a really good paper that I've, sorry, are we still, something's come up on the screen, but I assume you can still hear me. There we go. There's a good paper that I've seen recently by Radcliffe and Nodell, published in January last year, called Ethical by Design: Managing and Measuring Digital Ethics in the Enterprise. Now, this is not specifically digital, not specifically AI ethics, but I think it does give quite a good foundation for firms thinking about how do you make sure that the whole approach of the enterprise to digital ethics is rooted in the company to manage your risk. I think for me, if I may, it's like now Greyhound's gone out of business, so I'll use them. If Greyhound appoint a bus driver and they are negligent in making the bus driver spend too much time on the road, not providing the right infrastructure, and the bus has a crash, then management is liable. If, however, they do everything right, they do all the testing, they do all the screening and they provide all the encouragement and support, but one particular bus driver goes and gets drunk and then has an accident and kills people, that's not management's primary responsibility. So I think there's a lot of general practice in terms of liability and ethics that does apply, but I'm sure AI will stretch that as it does everything. Okay, it is now 5:02. What I'm proposing to do is we'll have one last round, which will take us to about 5:10, and then we're going to wrap up. So people, the impact on jobs. I mean, if you read the literature, some people say that as many as 20 to 30% of jobs will be displaced by AI, not destroyed, note, displaced, which means people will need to learn new skills. And if they can't, then they will be in a difficult position. So that's the first part. The second part of the question is, a simple rule of thumb used to be, AI was capable of doing structured cognitive work, whereas unstructured cognitive work was still the realm of human beings. Anything that was high in creative dexterity or sort of relational dexterity or physical dexterity for that matter. Are those guidelines still relevant? And thirdly, what is the obligation on firms implementing AI with regard to the job challenge in South Africa? You know, there's technology mustn't serve itself, it must serve the organization, and the organization is part of a society. So ultimately, technology has to serve society. Where is at the moment, where is the ethical boundary in terms of AI versus jobs, in your opinions? Simple questions.
So I'm going to start. I think at the end of the day, there are two ways to look at AI taking jobs or absorbing jobs. The first is an AI doing a job that would be a repetitive task that really no human should be doing in the first place, because it's mundane and it's boring and it's not mentally stimulating and it's potentially forced labor in certain countries and so forth. That's the first question. The second question more relates to, if that is the case, if those jobs are going to be taken, what responsibility are the people implementing the AI What responsibility do they take in terms of looking at how they can upskill those workers? So wouldn't it be wonderful if we could all do like creatively stimulating, strategic, interesting work and improve our lives? However, if the implementation of that AI is going to be to simply replace jobs and not do anything to actually compensate that workforce or allow them to upskill, you have an issue. But imagine a world in which algorithms are doing everything and we all get a universal basic income to, I don't know, learn how to build snowmen or learn how to ski or any of the wonderful things you would probably rather spend doing if you didn't have to actually work. You know, everybody has healthcare, everybody has education, everybody gets to sit around and philosophize about what the AI ethics should have been. The question just is what are the companies doing that are implementing these algorithms and AI as a whole that will be absorbing jobs to make sure that the people who are affected by it are taken care of? Because they will disappear, and there are many instances in which jobs will disappear faster than others. And this becomes a societal problem as far as I'm concerned, and something we should all speak up about and ask of our companies what they're doing to help secure our jobs in the future or potentially our futures.
Yeah, I agree. Any other thoughts on that diverse array of questions there?
Yeah, so
okay, actually, go
let's
ahead.
do this. So essentially, what I'd like to talk about is what is the responsibility of firms to actually adopt AI? I think that is the question. And what I'd like to say is AI is actually here. we can't run away from it. It's actually here in your phone. There's several AI assisted services that you're using currently that you may or may not be aware of. So as much as we say that we may not necessarily be ready for AI, or AI is still far away, or AI is going to be potentially irrelevant in the future, the fact is that AI is here, and there are companies that are already utilizing AI for their benefit. So the responsibility for a firm is no different from wanting to achieve more in your own business, because it is quite evident that utilizing AI in your business and going down that whole data-driven approach is actually beneficial to your business. So in order to actually survive these economic conditions, I think it's actually prudent to take on more AI-related projects and also start adopting more of a mindset that actually takes on AI as a forefront. I think another point that I'd like to mention is with regards to, and Catherine touched on this as well, with regards to actual jobs. A mindset that we do kind of need to adopt is the fact that AI is actually here to assist us. It's not here to actually take over jobs. So when we are actually implementing AI-related solutions, it's a more matter of how can we use AI to assist the jobs, assist people who are currently doing mundane jobs, and how can we also upskill these people at the same time? So I think this is actually responsibility for the firms to actually consider these sort of strategic decisions as well.
Thanks, Archie. Houston?
Yeah, so I agree, actually. I think, and Catherine, when you talked about the repetitive tasks, for the example I gave, when it comes to credit risk, there's some applications that are obvious. When someone applies, let's say you're a new CA, and you're applying for a car loan. You're probably going to apply for maybe say an I-20 or one of those, or VW Polos, right? You really wouldn't want a human to go through all those applications. You want the human to focus on very, very difficult tasks that need human thinking, human ingenuity. So there you can make use of AI to take care of those mundane applications. That's just an example, and let the human focus on where the creativity is needed. So that's saying, but you're right. It's a very, because there are some people it will be difficult to upskill because we have a missing middle. There are some people where it will be difficult for them to upskill. But one thing I would say is the firms really need to think about, when we employ AI, who is most likely going to be negatively impacted by this application that we're putting in.
Yeah, if I may just weigh in on this point very quickly, I personally don't think we have the luxury of ignoring AI. AI is fundamental to a firm's competitiveness, as with any form of digitalization, by the way. It is a part of the competitiveness of the firm, and in a globally competitive economy, we don't have the luxury of ignoring it, because it reduces error rates, it is quicker, it's generally more accurate, it's more scalable, all those things. So we can't not do it. But there's a big but. The big but is the impact on people has to be factored in from the beginning. HR and all the associated practices need to be in at the beginning of the project, not at the 90% mark where you're ready to go live and scale and suddenly you realize, oh, we've got 1,000 people that are going to be impacted. Then, so for me, there's a huge responsibility on companies to make sure that they provide all the support they can with regard to reskilling, redirecting, and so on. Okay, we are now at 10 past. I'm going to give you each literally, I apologize to those on the call that we haven't been able to address your questions. As it is, we've only been able to really just skim the surface on the questions we have addressed. But I'm going to ask each of the panelists to provide literally a 30-second key takeaways. What are your 1 or 2 key takeaways? And then I'll bring things to a close. So we'll go in reverse order. Houston, we'll wrap up.
Yeah, I think the key takeaway for me is AI is here. AI is here. I think we've been saying it. AI is here. We just need to learn. We need to know how to work with AI. And for anyone in the chat, and you're saying, but I did economics, I did philosophy, I did this, I didn't do computer science. My advice is always, you really do not need to code to be the one doing the coding, but know how to leverage AI. It's like driving a car. I personally, I might not know the intricacies of how the car works internally, but I can drive it. So with AI, there's so many tools that are being built where you really do not need to know the coding, but you need to know how to leverage it, because AI is here and it's going to change. It's going to change all our lives, like every aspect of our daily lives and our working lives. So yeah, that's just my.
Thanks, Houston. Archie?
Cool. Yeah, I have to agree with that, Houston, as well. AI is definitely here. I think for me, it's more also, along with, yes, AI is here and we do definitely need to be able to know how to leverage it. It's also a case of we need to get away from the mindset of saying that AI is only for tech people. AI is actually for everyone. We actually need to start incorporating more people as part of the discussion. It's actually a larger than just the technical element that we need to solve for. So it's more, it needs to be more inclusive. We need to start bringing in the soft skills. We need to start bringing in the hard skills, whichever skills we need to bring in, they need to be as part of the journey. And it's also important to leverage of people who have actually got skills in the industry, who have actually learned from their mistakes, and in order to help you isolate specific use cases that you can actually use AI for. Don't go in blind. There's more than enough people who have made mistakes to learn from. So it's always important to choose your right use cases as well, and don't ignore ethics or privacy or any kind of data related issues that we have. It is something that we need to cater for. And that's me.
Thank you. Catherine, last but by no means least.
I'll keep mine short. I think the takeaway is don't be afraid of it, because at the end of the day, as both Archie and Houston have pointed out, I guess maybe a good analogy would be if you're about to have a baby, you're not going to sit in isolation and not find out what the implications of it is or how you should raise it or what you should consider. And so I think, just as scary as it is to give birth and be a new parent, I think the same should apply here. Find out as much as you can, ask other people for their advice, figure out what you want your child to be raised as, understand what the impact of that will be, not only on your life, but on the lives of people around you. And as I mentioned before, I think fear is the biggest inhibitor because we believe it's something bigger than us, and it's not. We all form part of the solution in building the way forward. And actually, there are so many upsides to this that I believe far outweigh the downsides. And, if you look at the mRNA vaccine that's just been produced, it would not have been possible without AI. So maybe stop thinking about the bad stuff and start figuring out how you in your personal capacity as well as within a company structure can harness it and really kind of drive innovation, which is so exciting. So
excellent. Thank you very much. So AI is here to stay. AI is for everybody. AI can be a force for good if ethically applied. And I just want to emphasize all of you, those are essentially the 3 points that you guys wrapped up with. I think the point is that we don't all have to be coders and technologists. As Houston said, it is what we do with the technology rather than inventing new technology that is important for us. For 97% of the economy, there's 3% of the economy that actually needs to do the tech and really get good at it and be at the cutting edge. 97% of the economy has to figure out what to do with it and use it smartly and wisely and ethically. The last point, and it's probably a good place to end, don't be afraid of it, as Catherine said. And one of the biggest causes of fear is ignorance. So it's incumbent on all of us, I think, to find out more and to make sure that we are informed about it, because information and knowledge drives out fear. And therefore, congratulations to everybody for being part of this webinar and being part of the conversation and expanding all of our mutual understanding of what AI is, what it can do, who it applies to, what works, what doesn't work, what to be afraid of, but most importantly, the incredibly powerful good that it can bring if properly employed. So thank you, everybody. Thanks to the panelists for your incredible insights and the time you've taken. Thank you to Retendo and the team behind her for making this real, but most of all, thank you, everybody. There were, at one point, I saw several hundred people on the call. So thank you for joining. I hope you found it useful, and we'll see you again soon. With that, Rue, we are done.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Cheers all.
Yeah, cheers everyone. Bye.